forward operating base Sentinel stretched across the desert like a collection of forgotten boxes. Its concrete barriers and razor wire creating a harsh geometry against the endless sand. The morning sun cast long shadows between the prefabricated structures as soldiers moved with purposeful urgency, preparing for what command had designated Operation Mercy Hand. The air carried the familiar cocktail of diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of weapons being cleaned and loaded. Rachel Martinez moved through this organized chaos with practiced efficiency, her weathered hands methodically arranging ammunition crates near the armory tent. Unlike the soldiers bustling around her, she wore plain fatigues with no rank insignia or unit patches visible on her shoulders. Just another support staff member, invisible to those focused on what they considered real military work. The base had been her home for 3 days now, and in that time, not a single person had bothered to ask her name. She was simply the supply girl, or logistics, when anyone bothered to acknowledge her at all. Rachel preferred it that way. Anonymity was a tool she had learned to wield with surgical precision. Master Sergeant Derek Callahan strode through the supply area, his voice carrying across the compound as he briefed his team. 6 soldiers followed in his wake, their expressions mixing determination with barely concealed anxiety. This was not a training exercise, and everyone knew it. "Listen up, people," Callahan announced, pausing near the ammunition stockpile where Rachel worked. Those aid workers have less than 72 hours before Vargas decides they're more valuable dead than alive. We move fast, we move quiet, and we bring them home. As Callahan continued his briefing, he stepped backward and nearly tripped over one of Rachel's carefully arranged crates. He caught himself and spun around, eyes narrowing as they fell on her without really seeing her. "Watch your placement, supply girl," he barked without truly looking at her. "Some of us have actual combat to prepare for." Rachel said nothing, simply adjusted the crate and continued her work. Her gray eyes revealed nothing, her movements remaining steady and purposeful despite the interruption. She had learned long ago that the best response to dismissal was competence that spoke louder than words. Sergeant Callahan, one of the younger soldiers, called out. "Intel just updated the target location. Lieutenant Hawkins wants you at command." Callahan grunted in acknowledgement and moved away, already focused on the mission ahead. None of them glanced back at Rachel, who continued organizing ammunition by caliber and purpose, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with every type of round in the military arsenal. An hour later, Rachel approached the command tent with a clipboard in hand. Lieutenant Jessica Hawkins stood at a tactical table covered with maps and satellite imagery, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun as she discussed entry points with 2 communication specialists. The tent hummed with the quiet intensity of mission preparation. Rachel waited patiently until there was a break in conversation. "Request access to the weapons locker for inventory, ma'am," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Hawkins barely glanced up from her tablet. "Denied. Logistics personnel do not have clearance during mission prep. Come back tomorrow." "The mission requires specialized ammunition," Rachel noted calmly, her tone remaining neutral. "Standard procedure requires verification 12 hours before deployment." This time, Hawkins looked up, irritation flashing across her features. "Are you questioning my decision?" Her voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby personnel. "I have been planning this operation for a week. The ammunition is accounted for." "I understand, Lieutenant," Rachel replied, her tone remaining neutral. "I'm simply noting what the manual requires." "I know the procedures," Hawkins snapped. "I also know we have 3 aid workers who will be executed if we don't move quickly. Your inventory can wait." Rachel simply nodded and walked away, neither her expression nor her posture revealing any reaction to the dismissal. As she passed the tactical table, she paused briefly, her eyes scanning the map of the mountain range where the aid workers were reportedly held. Her gaze lingered on particular ridgelines with unusual interest, noting the marked insertion points and the valley approach that had been highlighted as the primary infiltration route. "That area is classified," Hawkins called out sharply. "Return to your duties." Without a word, Rachel moved on, returning to the ammunition depot where she resumed organizing crates with the same methodical precision as before. Her apparent acceptance of her role made her effectively invisible to the soldiers preparing for combat, allowing her to observe everything while being observed by no one. The midday sun beat down mercilessly as Rachel transported a fresh shipment of ammunition from the supply helicopter to the staging area. Private Tyler Brooks, a fresh-faced soldier barely out of training, lounged with 3 other junior enlisted men near the water station. His eyes tracked Rachel's movement with the predatory interest of someone looking for entertainment. "Hey, guys, watch this," he muttered as Rachel approached with her arms full of equipment as she passed. Brooks deliberately stepped into her path, bumping her shoulder hard enough to send several boxes of ammunition tumbling to the ground. Rachel managed to keep her balance, but the carefully sorted rounds scattered across the dusty ground like spilled coins. "Oops," Brooks smirked, making no move to help. "Better clean that up, supply girl. We wouldn't want anyone important tripping." Laughter rippled through the group as Rachel knelt to reorganize the ammunition. Her movements remained methodical, unhurried. The young soldiers watched for a moment, waiting for a reaction that never came. Her silence seemed to frustrate them more than anger would have. "What's wrong with her?" one of them muttered. "Does she even speak? Who cares?" Brooks replied, "She's just another drone they send out here to count bullets while we do the real work." As Rachel reached for a box that had slid farther away, her collar shifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of dark red fabric sewn to the inside before she subtly adjusted it closed again. None of the soldiers noticed the brief exposure as they wandered away, already bored with their momentary entertainment. The afternoon stretched on with Rachel continuing her work, moving between supply tents and mission preparation areas with quiet efficiency. She listened as soldiers discussed the upcoming operation, absorbing details about timelines, extraction plans, and known enemy positions. No one questioned her presence or censored their conversations around her. The advantage of being considered irrelevant. As evening approached, final mission preparations were underway in the command tent. Rachel positioned herself near the entrance, organizing ammunition into mission-specific packs, while Callahan argued with Lieutenant Hawkins over tactical approaches. The tension in the tent was palpable, careers and lives hanging in the balance of their decisions. "The northern ridge gives us better visibility," Hawkins insisted, pointing at the map with conviction. "And zero cover," Callahan countered, his voice tight with frustration. "Might as well paint targets on our backs." "The satellite imagery shows minimal activity at the western approach," a communications officer interjected, pointing to a valley route. "It appears to be our clearest path." At this, Rachel glanced up briefly from her task, studying the marked route with subtle intensity that would have been telling to anyone paying attention. "That valley is a natural choke point," Callahan muttered, unconvinced. "Something doesn't feel right about it." Hawkins noticed Rachel listening and frowned. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" she asked pointedly. "She's prepping our ammunition," Callahan said, then added gruffly, "Just don't screw it up like the last supply clerk." "That mission was a disaster." "I'll ensure everything is properly prepared, Sergeant," Rachel replied, a voice revealing nothing as she continued her work. As she leaned forward to lift a heavy case, her collar shifted again, revealing more of that dark red fabric with what appeared to be black stitching. This time, Callahan noticed. his brow furrowed as he studied her with new attention, continuing his briefing, but now frequently glancing her way with growing suspicion and curiosity. Something about the way she moved, the way she absorbed information, without seeming to listen, triggered an instinct he couldn't quite place. Years of combat had taught him to trust those instincts, and right now, they were telling him that Rachel Martinez was not what she appeared to be. The question was, what was she hiding, and why was she really here? The pre-dawn hours at Forward Operating Base Sentinel carried a different quality of tension. The usual bustle had given way to the focused quiet of final preparations, where every sound seemed amplified and every decision carried weight. Rachel continued her methodical work in the ammunition depot, but the atmosphere around her had begun to shift in ways she couldn't ignore. Master Sergeant Callahan found himself returning to the supply area more frequently than mission prep required. Each time, his eyes lingered on Rachel with growing intensity, studying her movements with the practiced observation of a 20-year veteran who had learned to read people like terrain maps. "Where exactly did you serve before this posting?" he asked during one of these visits. His tone casual, but his attention sharp. Rachel looked up from the rifle magazine she was organizing. "Joint Logistics Support, Sergeant. Various locations." "That's pretty vague," Callahan pressed, moving closer. "Most support personnel can tell you exactly where they've been, down to the month and year." "Different operations have different requirements," Rachel replied, returning to her work. "Sometimes the details aren't meant for general discussion." It was a perfect non-answer that revealed everything and nothing simultaneously. Callahan felt that familiar itch between his shoulder blades, the one that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. Something was wrong with this picture, but he couldn't quite identify what. Lieutenant Hawkins approached them, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone dealing with last-minute complications. "Martinez," she said, reading from the screen, "your transfer orders are incomplete. No previous commanding officer listed, no specific unit designation, and your security clearance level is redacted." Rachel continued her work without looking up. "Administrative oversight, ma'am. Happens sometimes with joint operations." "It doesn't happen with my operations," Hawkins snapped. "I run a tight ship here, and I don't like mysteries on my team. I want a full explanation of your background. By 0800, or you're off this base." "Understood, Lieutenant," Rachel replied, her voice remaining steady despite the implicit threat. After Hawkins left, Callahan remained, studying Rachel with new intensity. "You know," he said slowly, "I've seen a lot of logistics personnel over the years. Most of them are either chatty types who won't shut up about their last posting, or nervous kids fresh out of training. And neither." Rachel met his eyes briefly. "Is that a problem, Sergeant?" "Depends," Callahan replied. "See, I noticed something interesting during yesterday's briefing. When we were discussing the Western Valley approach, you had a reaction. Subtle, but it was there. Like you knew something about that terrain." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and carefully maintained facades. Rachel returned to organizing ammunition, but Callahan could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the barely perceptible change in her breathing pattern. "I've been reading maps since I was 12, she said finally. "Some terrain just looks problematic." "Maybe," Callahan conceded. "Or maybe you've been there before." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Michael Vaden, whose unexpected presence in the ammunition depot immediately changed the dynamic. His weathered face revealed nothing as his eyes swept across the tactical displays before pausing when they reached Rachel. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Whatever it was quickly suppressed, but not before Callahan caught the momentary break in the colonel's professional mask. "Sergeant Callahan," Vaden said, his voice deliberately casual. How are the final preparations coming along? On schedule, sir, Callahan replied, though his attention remained divided between his commanding officer and the logistics worker, who seemed to be generating unusual interest. Good, Vaden nodded, then turned to Rachel. And you're managing the ammunition requirements adequately? Yes, sir, Rachel replied, not looking up from her work. Excellent. Vaden's tone remained neutral, but his eyes never left Rachel. Carry on. As the colonel departed, Callahan felt the pieces of a puzzle shifting in his mind, forming patterns he couldn't quite see, but knew were there. The way Vaden had looked at Rachel, the careful neutrality of his tone, the fact that he had bothered to check on ammunition prep personally, none of it added up to routine command oversight. Private Brooks and his group appeared again, drawn by some combination of boredom and the irresistible urge to assert dominance over someone they perceived as powerless. They positioned themselves near Rachel's work area, their conversation deliberately loud and dismissive. I heard the supply clerk thinks she knows better than Lieutenant Hawkins about mission planning, Brooks announced to his friends, glancing pointedly at Rachel. Probably thinks she could lead the operation herself. One of his companions laughed. Maybe we should let her. Could be entertaining watching her try to hold a real weapon. Rachel continued her work, her movements unchanged, but Callahan noticed the way her hands never hesitated, never fumbled. For someone supposedly unfamiliar with combat operations, she handled military equipment with remarkable confidence. You know what I think? Brooks continued, emboldened by Rachel's silence. I think our little supply girl here is hiding something. Maybe she got kicked out of her last unit for screwing up. Maybe that's why her records are so mysterious. That's enough, Private, Callahan interjected, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Brooks looked surprised. Just making conversation, Sergeant. No harm in wondering about new team members, right? There's harm in speculation that undermines unit cohesion, Callahan replied firmly. Find something useful to do. As the group dispersed, Brooks shot Rachel a look that promised future trouble. She met his eyes briefly, and for just a moment, Callahan caught something in her expression. Not fear or resignation, but the cold assessment of someone evaluating a potential threat. Later that evening, as the base settled into the tense quiet that preceded major operations, Callahan found himself walking past the supply tent where Rachel had made her temporary quarters. Through the partially open flap, he could see her sitting at a small field desk, writing in what appeared to be a detailed report. Her movements were precise, economical, and there was something about her posture that reminded him of other soldiers he had known, the ones who carried themselves with the unconscious confidence of extensive combat experience. A communication technician approached, carrying a priority message. Sergeant Callahan? Intelligence update from higher command. The target location has been confirmed, but there are some complications. Callahan took the message, scanning its contents with growing concern. New intelligence suggested the enemy had significantly more resources in the area than originally estimated. The mission parameters were being questioned at the highest levels. Through the tent flap, he saw Rachel pause in her writing, her head tilted slightly as if listening to their conversation. When the technician departed, she resumed her work, but Callahan had the distinct impression that she had absorbed every word of the intelligence update. Interesting night for information gathering, he said, stepping into the tent. Rachel looked up from her report. I'm just completing my daily logs, Sergeant. Daily logs, Callahan repeated. Most logistics personnel write maybe 2 paragraphs about inventory counts. That looks like a comprehensive operational assessment. I'm thorough, Rachel replied simply. Callahan studied her in the dim light of the battery-powered lamp. You know, I keep coming back to that moment during the briefing when you looked at the Western Valley route. There was something in your expression, like you were seeing a mistake being made, Rachel set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "What are you asking, Sergeant?" "I'm asking if there's something about this mission that you know and we don't," Callahan said directly. "Because if there is, and good soldiers die because you stayed quiet, that blood is on your hands." The weight of his words hung in the air. Between them, Rachel's expression remained neutral, but Callahan could see her calculating, weighing options he couldn't begin to understand. "The mission will proceed as planned," she said finally. "I'm just here to ensure adequate ammunition, supplies." But as Callahan left the tent, he couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel Martinez knew exactly what was waiting for them in those mountains, and that she was the only one who did. Dawn arrived at Forward Operating Base Sentinel with the weight of inevitability. The mission was set to launch in 6 hours, and the entire compound hummed with the focused energy of final preparations. Rachel moved through her routine with the same methodical precision, but the scrutiny around her had intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Lieutenant Hawkins had made good on her threat, arriving at the ammunition depot with 2 military, police officers and a handful of official documents. Her expression carried the satisfaction of someone who believed they were about to solve a troublesome mystery. "Martinez," Hawkins announced, her voice carrying across the supply area and drawing attention from nearby soldiers. "Your background check came back with some interesting gaps. Seems like there are several years of your service record that are completely classified above my clearance level." Rachel continued organizing ammunition without looking up. "Some assignments require higher security protocols, ma'am." "Not for logistics personnel," Hawkins shot back. "The only people with that level of classification are intelligence operatives and special operations units. So which are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Rachel could feel the weight of multiple gazes settling on her. Soldiers had stopped their work to listen, sensing drama unfolding. Even Master Sergeant Callahan had appeared, positioning himself where he could observe the confrontation. "I'm a logistics specialist, Lieutenant," Rachel replied calmly. "My job is to ensure this mission has adequate ammunition supplies." "Your job," Hawkins said, stepping closer, "is to answer my questions honestly. Because right now, you look like either a security risk or someone who's been lying about their qualifications. Either way, you're off this operation." Private Brooks had edged closer with his usual group, their expressions mixing curiosity with anticipation. The dynamic had shifted into something resembling a public trial, with Rachel as the defendant facing an increasingly hostile prosecutor. "Ma'am," Callahan interjected, "perhaps this conversation would be better conducted privately." "No," Hawkins replied firmly. "I want everyone to understand that on my operations, we don't tolerate mysteries or lies. Martinez here has been operating under false pretenses, and now she's going to explain exactly who she is and what she's really doing here." Rachel finally stopped her work and stood, facing Hawkins directly. For the first time since arriving at the base, she allowed her full attention to focus on a single person, and the change was immediately noticeable. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but suddenly she seemed to occupy more space, to carry more presence. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "I recommend you verify my clearance level through proper channels before making accusations." "I've tried," Hawkins snapped. "Your file is locked down tighter than nuclear codes. The only explanation is that you're either way above your stated position or you're running some kind of con. Either way, you're done here." The crowd of soldiers had grown, drawn by the confrontation like moths to flame. Rachel could feel their collective judgment, their assumption that she was about to be exposed as a fraud or failure. The familiar weight of being underestimated settled around her shoulders like an old coat. "Ma'am," Rachel said, her voice remaining level despite the public humiliation, "I understand your concerns. Perhaps we could discuss this after the mission." "There is no after the mission for you," Hawkins declared. "You're confined to quarters pending investigation. MPs will escort you off this base as soon as transport is available." The dismissal was final, absolute, and deliberately humiliating. Brooks actually smirked, clearly enjoying watching the mysterious supply clerk get her comeuppance. Several other soldiers exchanged glances that suggested they had always known something was off about the quiet woman who kept to herself. Rachel nodded once, accepting the sentence without protest. As she began gathering her personal equipment, Callahan stepped forward. "Lieutenant, perhaps we should wait until after the mission to make personnel changes. We're 6 hours from deployment. The mission will proceed without logistics support if necessary," Hawkins replied. "I won't have security risks on my operation." As the crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the confrontation had ended so anticlimactically, Colonel Vaden appeared at the edge of the group. His presence was felt before he spoke, causing immediate stiffening of postures and sharpening of attention. "Is there a problem here, Lieutenant?" he asked, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having problems solved. Before they reached his attention, "Sir, I've identified a security concern with our logistics support," Hawkins replied, her confidence unwavering. "Martinez here has classified credentials above my clearance level and has been evasive about her background. I've ordered her confined pending investigation." Baden's expression revealed nothing as his eyes moved from Hawkins to Rachel, who stood quietly beside her packed equipment. The moment stretched uncomfortably long, filled with tension that seemed to radiate outward from the colonel's silent assessment. "I see," he said finally. "And you made this determination without consulting higher command." "Sir, I have the authority to remove personnel I deem security risks from my operations," Hawkins replied, though a note of uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Yes," Vaden agreed. "You do. However, you also have the responsibility to understand who you're removing before you make that decision." Something in his tone caused Hawkins to pause, her confidence beginning to waver. Callahan watched the exchange with growing interest, sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. "Sir?" Hawkins prompted when the colonel remained silent. Vaden turned to Rachel, who met his gaze steadily. "Operator," he said quietly, using a title that made several soldiers look confused. "Your assessment of the current mission parameters?" The word operator hung in the air like a revelation, causing immediate shifts in the crowd's attention. Rachel looked at Vaden for a long moment, then at the assembled soldiers, and finally at Lieutenant Hawkins, whose expression had moved from confidence to confusion to the first stirrings of concern. "Sir," Rachel replied, her voice carrying a different quality now, "the current approach will result in casualties. The intelligence is incomplete." "Explain," Vaden commanded. Rachel stepped to the tactical map that had been set up near the ammunition depot, her movements suddenly carrying unmistakable authority. As she began pointing to specific locations, soldiers instinctively moved closer, drawn by the confidence in her voice. "The Western Valley approach is a deliberate trap," she said, her finger tracing the planned route. "The enemy has established overlapping fields of fire here and here. The satellite imagery showing minimal activity is intentional misdirection." The crowd had gone completely silent, their earlier dismissal replaced by focused attention. Even Private Brooks was listening with the intensity of someone beginning to understand they have badly misjudged the situation. "How could you possibly know that?" Hawkins demanded, but her voice carried less authority than it had moments before. Rachel met her eyes directly. "Because I've been there, Lieutenant. Multiple times." The implications of that statement settled over the group like a physical weight. Callahan felt pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place, forming a picture that was both clear and impossible to fully comprehend. Colonel Vaden stepped forward, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the assembled crowd. "Allow me to properly introduce Operator Rachel Martinez of Echo Red." The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Soldiers who had been dismissive or curious suddenly stood straighter, their expressions shifting to something approaching awe. Echo Red was a legend, a unit that officially didn't exist but was whispered about in the darkest corners of military operations. Private Brooks looked like he had been struck by lightning, his earlier arrogance replaced by the horrified realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. Lieutenant Hawkins stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as she processed the magnitude of her mistake. "Echo Red operators," Vaden continued, "have a perfect mission success rate. When Operator Martinez tells us the current plan will result in casualties, we listen." Rachel reached into her collar and pulled out the red patch with its distinctive black threading, holding it where everyone could see. The symbol that had been hidden beneath plain fatigues was now revealed in all its significance, the mark of the most elite and secretive unit in the American military. The woman they had dismissed as a supply clerk, mocked as irrelevant, and nearly thrown off the base was one of the most dangerous and capable operators in the world. And now, with 6 hours until a mission that could cost lives, she was their only hope of success. The revelation of Rachel's true identity transformed forward operating Base Sentinel in ways that went far beyond the immediate mission. The atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a storm, with soldiers moving differently around, someone they now understood to be operating on a level they had never encountered. Colonel Vaden cleared the area around the tactical display, leaving only essential personnel for what had become an emergency mission briefing. Lieutenant Hawkins stood to one side, her earlier confidence replaced by the careful stillness of someone trying to process a fundamental shift in reality. "Operator Martinez," Vaden said formally, "please brief us on the current threat assessment." Rachel approached the map with movements that suddenly seemed to carry years of invisible experience. Every gesture was economical, purposeful, speaking to training that went far beyond anything the assembled soldiers had imagined. "The target location has been compromised for 3 weeks, she began, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Vargas has been using the aid workers as bait, knowing that rescue attempts would eventually come through the Western Valley. It's the only approach that looks viable from satellite intelligence." She pointed to specific coordinates on the map. "He has sniper teams positioned here, and here, with overlapping fields of fire covering the entire valley floor. The teams are equipped with long-range weapons and have been practicing this exact scenario for weeks." Master Sergeant Callahan leaned forward, studying the marked positions. "That would put any rescue team in a kill zone before they even reach the target building." "Correct," Rachel confirmed. "The plan is to eliminate the rescue team, then execute the hostages on camera to send the message. Standard psychological warfare tactics for this region." Lieutenant Hawkins found her voice, though it carried none of its earlier authority. How long have you known this?" Rachel met her eyes without hostility. "I've been gathering intelligence since my arrival. The mission parameters were wrong from the beginning, but correcting them required establishing credibility. By letting us think you were just support staff," Callahan said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Echo Red operators work in the shadows," Colonel Vaden explained to the group. "Their effectiveness depends on remaining unnoticed until the moment action is required. Operator Martinez has been conducting surveillance and intelligence gathering while maintaining perfect cover." Private Brooks, who had been standing at the back of the group, stepped forward hesitantly. His face carried the expression of someone grappling with shame and the magnitude of his earlier behavior. "Ma'am," he said to Rachel, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. My behavior was inexcusable." Rachel studied him for a moment. "You acted according to your understanding of the situation, Private." That's not uncommon in this environment. But I was wrong, Brooks pressed. Completely wrong. About everything. Yes, Rachel agreed simply. You were. The question is what you learned from that experience. The directness of her response carried more impact than anger would have. Brooks nodded, accepting the lesson with the gravity it deserved. The immediate question, Vaden interjected, is how we proceed with the mission. Our current timeline puts us 6 hours from deployment with a plan that will result in casualties. Rachel returned to the map, her finger tracing an alternative. Rode through terrain that hadn't appeared in any of the original briefings. There's a secondary approach through the northern ridgeline. Difficult terrain, but it puts us above the sniper positions and provides access to the compound through a maintenance tunnel that Vargas doesn't know we've identified. How do you know about the tunnel? Hawkins asked. Previous operations. Rachel replied without elaboration. Callahan studied the new route with the eye of someone who had led soldiers through hostile territory for 2 decades. That approach would require specialized equipment and expertise in mountainous terrain. Infiltration. My team doesn't have that level of training. No, Rachel agreed. They don't. The implication hung in the air for a moment before Vaden spoke. Operator Martinez will lead the mission. Sir, Hawkins protested. With all due respect, I've been planning this operation for weeks. I know every detail, every contingency. Lieutenant, Vaden replied firmly. You've been planning an operation based on incomplete intelligence that would have resulted in casualties. Operator Martinez has been gathering accurate intelligence while maintaining operational security. There's no comparison. Rachel studied the assembled group, evaluating each person with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to working with unfamiliar teams under high-stress conditions. The mission will require a smaller team, she said. 6 operators maximum. Moving in complete silence through difficult terrain. Anyone not capable of that level of performance becomes a liability. She looked directly at Brooks. Private, your earlier behavior suggests inexperience with high-stakes operations. Are you prepared to follow orders without question and maintain operational discipline under extreme stress? Brooks straightened. Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Good, Rachel replied. Because in approximately 5 hours, your life and the lives of your teammates will depend on your ability to move through hostile territory without making a sound. The weight of responsibility settled over the group like a physical presence. These soldiers had trained for combat operations, but they were about to experience something far beyond their previous scope of experience. Sergeant Callahan, Rachel, continued, your team has good instincts and adequate training. However, they've never operated with Echo Red protocols. Are you prepared to adapt your leadership style to accommodate operational requirements you've never encountered? Callahan met her gaze steadily. I've been in the military for 20 years, operator. I've learned to adapt to whatever the mission requires. We'll see, Rachel replied, neither encouragement nor discouragement in her tone as the briefing continued. Soldiers throughout the base began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. An Echo Red operator had revealed herself and taken control of an active mission, transforming everything they thought they knew about the operation. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, and nearly removed from the base was now their only hope of completing the mission without casualties. And as she outlined a new approach with the confidence of someone who had done this 47 times before, they began to understand exactly how outclassed they had been from the moment she arrived. The mission was no longer about rescuing 3 aid workers. It had become about proving themselves worthy of operating alongside a legend who had chosen to step out of the shadows to save their lives. The transformation of forward operating base sentinels' mission parameters rippled through every aspect of the operation like a stone dropped in still water. Within 2 hours of Rachel's revelation, Equipment had been reconfigured, personnel reassigned, and tactical plans completely rewritten based on intelligence that had been gathered invisibly. Over 3 days, Rachel moved through the base with a different energy now. Her cover blown, but her effectiveness multiplied. Soldiers who had previously ignored her now watched her every movement with the intense attention of people trying to learn from a master craftsman. The Northern Ridgeline approach requires different equipment entirely, she explained to the assembled team in the command tent. Standard insertion gear won't work for the terrain we'll be crossing. She had requisitioned specialized climbing equipment, night vision systems, and weapons that most of the soldiers had only heard about in whispered conversations. Everything was arranged with the methodical precision that had characterized her work as a supply clerk, but now it carried the weight of absolute authority. Lieutenant Hawkins struggled to find her place in the new hierarchy. Her carefully planned operation had been dismantled in favor of something far more complex and dangerous, led by someone whose existence she hadn't known about hours earlier. Operator Martinez, she said, attempting to maintain some level of involvement. What role does command structure play in this new approach? Rachel looked up from the equipment she was inspecting. Command structure follows competence and mission requirements. You plan based on the intelligence available to you. I'm planning based on intelligence you didn't have access to. It was a diplomatic way of saying that Hawkins was now operating outside her depth. But the message was clear to everyone in the tent. The mission had moved beyond conventional military planning into a realm where different rules applied. Private Brooks approached Rachel hesitantly, carrying a piece of communications equipment. "Ma'am, I've been assigned as your communications specialist for the mission. I wanted to verify the frequency protocols." Rachel examined the equipment with practiced efficiency. "Have you operated in communications blackout conditions before, Private?" "No, ma'am," Brooks admitted. "Most of my experience has been with standard patrol communications. This mission will require complete radio silence for approximately 4 hours," Rachel explained. "Hand signals, predetermined movements, and absolute discipline. One mistake in communications protocol could compromise the entire operation." Brooks nodded. "Seriously, I understand, ma'am. I won't let the team down." Rachel studied him for a moment. "Your earlier behavior suggested poor judgment and lack of situational awareness. Those are potentially fatal flaws in special operations environments. What's changed?" The directness of the question caught Brooks off guard, but he answered honestly. "Understanding what I was dealing with, ma'am. I made assumptions based on incomplete information and nearly compromised mission security as a result." "Good," Rachel replied. "That's the first lesson of working with incomplete intelligence. Never assume you understand the complete picture." Master Sergeant Callahan joined their conversation, carrying tactical maps marked with the new route. "Operator, I've reviewed the northern approach with my team leaders. The terrain is significantly more challenging than anything we've trained for." "Yes," Rachel agreed. "It is. My concern is that we're asking soldiers to perform beyond their training parameters under live fire conditions." Callahan continued. "That's a recipe for casualties." Rachel spread the tactical map on a nearby table, her finger tracing the planned route. "Sergeant, how many combat deployments have you completed?" 7, Callahan replied. "How many resulted in casualties?" Callahan's expression darkened. 3. "And how many Echo Red missions have resulted in casualties?" "I don't know," Callahan admitted. 0, Rachel replied simply. "In 47 missions across 15 years of operations. The terrain is challenging because it keeps us alive. Easy routes are death traps waiting to happen." The weight of that statistic settled over the group. 47 missions without a single casualty spoke to a level of operational excellence that existed in a different realm from conventional military operations. The hostages are being held in a compound that overlooks the Western Valley. Rachel continued, pointing to the target location. Vargas chose that position specifically because it allows him to observe and eliminate any rescue attempts from the obvious approach routes. The northern ridgeline puts us above his observation posts and outside his planned kill zones. She traced the route with her finger, each movement precise and purposeful. We'll approach through this ravine, using natural cover to mask our movement. The maintenance tunnel I mentioned provides access to the compound's lower level, bypassing the majority of his security measures. What about extraction? Callahan asked. Getting in through difficult terrain is one thing, but getting out with 3 potentially injured civilians is another. Rachel smiled for the first time since revealing her identity, and it carried the confidence of someone who had solved problems like this dozens of times before. That's where the real planning begins, Sergeant. As she outlined the extraction plan, soldiers throughout the tent found themselves witnessing tactical thinking at a level they had never encountered. Every contingency was anticipated, every potential complication addressed with solutions that spoke to years of experience in impossible situations. Colonel Vaden observed from the edge of the group, his expression revealing satisfaction at watching his soldiers receive an education in operational excellence from someone whose very existence was classified above their security clearance. Operator Martinez, he interjected. Timeline for deployment? 4 hours, Rachel replied without hesitation. Weather conditions will be optimal, and Vargas follows predictable patterns for guard rotations during evening hours. Lieutenant, Hawkins finally found an opportunity to contribute. What intelligence assets will we have during the operation? Satellite coverage, communication with base? None, Rachel replied simply. This is a blackout operation. Once we insert, we're completely autonomous until extraction. The implications of operating without external support clearly unsettled some of the soldiers, but Rachel's confidence seemed to reassure them that she had operated under these conditions many times before. Ma'am, Brooks asked, what happens if something goes wrong? If we encounter unexpected resistance or the hostages are in worse condition than anticipated? Rachel met his eyes directly. Then we adapt, overcome, and complete the mission. That's what separates special operations from conventional military actions, Private. The ability to succeed when everything goes wrong. As the briefing concluded, soldiers dispersed to prepare equipment and mentally prepare for an operation unlike anything they had previously experienced. The base's entire energy had shifted from nervous preparation to focused determination. Private Brooks lingered after the others had left, clearly struggling with something he needed to say. Ma'am, I keep thinking about how I treated you when you first arrived. The things I said, the way I acted. Rachel studied him quietly. What specifically troubles you about your behavior, Private? Everything, Brooks replied immediately. I was disrespectful, dismissive, and completely wrong about who you were and what you were doing here. Yes, Rachel agreed. You were. But, more importantly, you made those judgments based on assumptions rather than observation. That's a dangerous habit in military operations. Brooks nodded seriously. How do I fix that? How do I learn to see things the way you do? Rachel considered the question for a moment. Stop assuming you understand situations based on surface appearances. Start paying attention to details that don't fit your expectations. And remember that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones you don't see coming. As Brooks departed, Master Sergeant Callahan approached Rachel, his expression thoughtful. Operator, I have to ask, how long were you planning to maintain your cover if this mission hadn't required intervention? As long as necessary, Rachel replied. Echo. Red operators sometimes spend months or years in cover positions, gathering intelligence for operations that may never happen. That must be lonely, Callahan observed. Rachel's expression revealed nothing. Loneliness is a luxury we can't afford, Sergeant. The mission is everything. As evening approached and final preparations intensified, Rachel stood at the edge of the base, looking toward the mountains where 3 aid workers waited for rescue. The operation would begin in 3 hours, and everything would depend on soldiers who had never worked at this level following her lead, through terrain that could kill them if they made a single mistake. But for the first time since arriving at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, she wasn't working alone. And despite the risks, despite the challenges, she found herself cautiously optimistic about their chances of bringing everyone home alive. The real test would come when they reached the mountains and faced an enemy who had no idea that Echo Red had come for his hostages. The helicopters lifted off from Forward Operating Base Sentinel as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, their rotors cutting through air that carried the promise of violence. Rachel sat in the lead aircraft, studying the faces of soldiers who were about to experience combat at a level they had never imagined. The insertion point lay 12 miles from the target, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to reach the compound before dawn. Rachel had insisted on the distant approach, despite the additional difficulty it created. Echo Red operations succeeded because they anticipated every possible complication. 5 minutes to insertion, the pilot announced through their headsets. Rachel keyed her radio once, acknowledging the warning, then began her final equipment check with movements that spoke to ritual perfected through dozens of similar operations. Every piece of gear had been selected for specific purposes, every item positioned for immediate access in darkness. Master Sergeant Callahan watched her preparations with the attention of someone trying to absorb years of experience in minutes. Operator, what should we expect during the approach? Silence, Rachel replied simply. Complete noise discipline from the moment we hit the ground. Hand signals only, predetermined routes, no deviation from the plan unless I indicate otherwise. Private. Brooks adjusted his communications equipment, his earlier arrogance replaced by nervous determination. Ma'am, how will we know if we've been detected? We won't, Rachel answered. That's why we assume we're always being watched and act accordingly. The helicopter began its descent toward a landing zone that appeared as nothing more than a flat patch of ground among endless rocky terrain. Rachel could see the target compound in the distance, its lights creating a small constellation against the dark mountains. 30 seconds, the pilot announced. Rachel stood, checking her weapon one final time before moving toward the aircraft's door. The soldiers followed her lead, their movements carrying the careful precision of people who understood that mistakes would have consequences far beyond training exercises. The helicopter touched down with barely a whisper, its pilot executing a landing that spoke to extensive experience with special operations insertions. Rachel was first out, her boots hitting the ground with practiced silence as she immediately began scanning the surrounding terrain for threats. The soldiers followed, maintaining the spacing and formation she had drilled into them during their abbreviated training session. No one spoke. No equipment rattled. They moved like shadows across terrain that could conceal enemies or reveal their presence with equal ease. Rachel led them through a route that seemed to follow no logical pattern, winding between rock formations and using natural cover in ways that demonstrated intimate knowledge of the area. Every step was calculated, every pause deliberate. After 2 hours of careful movement, they reached the base of the northern ridgeline. The terrain ahead was nearly vertical, requiring climbing skills that pushed the limits of what the soldiers have learned in basic mountaineering training. Rachel paused at the base of the cliff, studying the route with night vision equipment that revealed handholds and anchor points invisible to the naked eye. She secured the first rope with movements that spoke to thousands of hours of similar operations. Callahan went second, his 20 years of experience evident in his steady progress. Up the rock face. Brooks followed, his youth and determination compensating for his lack of specialized training. One by one, the team ascended through darkness that concealed their movement from the compound below. The climb took 90 minutes, each soldier moving with the careful precision of people who understood that a single mistake could alert enemies to their presence. Rachel waited at the top, scanning the compound through specialized optics that revealed guard positions and movement patterns. 2 sentries on the eastern wall, she whispered into Callahan's ear. Patrol rotation every 20 minutes. 3rd, guard in the central tower, but he's focused on the western approach. Callahan nodded, passing the information to the next soldier in line. The team moved across the ridgeline like ghosts, using terrain features to mask their approach toward the maintenance tunnel that would provide access to the compound. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Rachel had indicated, concealed behind a rock formation that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. She produced lock-picking tools that seemed to dissolve the security measures like they were made of paper. Tunnel extends 40 meters, she whispered to the team. Opens into the compound's lower storage area. 3 possible routes to the holding area from there. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a single person, requiring them to move in single file through absolute darkness. Rachel led with confidence that spoke to previous reconnaissance, each step precise and certain despite the confined space. They emerged into a storage area filled with supplies and equipment that confirmed intelligence about the compound's purpose. Rachel immediately moved to a ventilation grate that provided access to the upper levels, her movements suggesting she had mentally rehearsed this exact sequence many times. The sound of voices filtered down from above, guards talking casually about rotation schedules and complaints about the food. Rachel listened for several minutes, gathering information about numbers, positions, and current status of the hostages. She turned to Callahan and held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the ceiling and traced a path that indicated the location of the holding area. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but the most dangerous part of the operation was about to begin. The rescue itself would require split-second timing, absolute coordination, and the kind of operational excellence that separated successful missions from disasters. Rachel looked at each soldier in turn, seeing determination mixed with appropriate fear in their expressions. She keyed her radio once, the signal indicating that Phase 2 was about to begin. In approximately 10 minutes, they would discover whether months of planning and years of experience could overcome an enemy who had been preparing for exactly this type of rescue attempt. The hostages were 30 feet above them, guarded by an unknown number of enemies who expected rescue attempts to come from a completely different direction. Everything depended on the next few minutes proceeding exactly as Rachel had planned, and as she began moving toward the ventilation access point, she allowed herself one moment of satisfaction at knowing that her cover at forward operating base Sentinel had been worth maintaining. The intelligence she had gathered over 3 days of being dismissed and underestimated was about to save lives. The ventilation shaft provided access to the compound's upper level, but it also amplified every sound they made. Rachel moved through the confined space with the fluid precision of someone who had navigated similar passages dozens of times. Each movement calculated to minimize noise while maintaining speed. Behind her, the soldiers followed with careful determination, their breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding their systems. 3 days ago, they had dismissed her as irrelevant support staff. Now their lives depended on following her lead through hostile territory, where a single mistake would alert enemies to their presence. Rachel paused at the shaft's exit, listening to voices from the room beyond. 2 guards were discussing shift changes, their conversation revealing that the hostages were being held in an adjacent room with minimal security, Exactly as her intelligence had indicated. She held up 2 fingers to Callahan, then pointed toward the door leading to the hostage. Holding area. Her hand signals indicated the precise positions of both guards and the sequence of actions required to neutralize them without raising an alarm. The ventilation grate opened silently under her touch, the result of preparation work conducted during previous reconnaissance missions that officially had never happened. Rachel dropped into the room with movements that made no sound, immediately positioning herself to engage both guards simultaneously. Callahan followed, his 20 years of experience evident in the fluid way he adapted to her lead. Private Brooks emerged last, his youth and training allowing him to move with surprising grace despite his earlier inexperience. The first guard never knew what happened. Rachel's approach was silent, precise, and concluded before he could react. The second guard began to turn, alerted by some instinct, but Callahan was already moving to intercept him. Within 30 seconds, both guards were neutralized without raising an alarm. Rachel immediately moved to the door leading to the hostage. Holding area, her movements suggesting she knew exactly what lay beyond. The 3 aid workers were secured with restraints, but appeared to be in reasonable physical condition. Their eyes widened as soldiers appeared in their holding room, relief mixing with disbelief at seeing American military personnel. "We're here to take you home," Rachel whispered to the nearest hostage, a woman in her 30s whose eyes revealed the strain of captivity. "Can you walk?" "Yes," the woman replied quietly. "We've been waiting for rescue, but they said no one would come through the northern approach." Rachel's expression revealed nothing, but Callahan caught the implication immediately. The hostages had been told that rescue attempts would come from the Western Valley, confirming that Vargas had planned to use them as bait for exactly the kind of operation Lieutenant Hawkins had originally designed. "How many guards in the compound?" Rachel asked as she worked to free their restraints. 8 total, the second hostage replied, a man whose medical training was evident in the way he immediately began assessing his companions for injuries. 3 in the towers, 2 patrolling the perimeter, and 3 inside the main building. The numbers matched Rachel's intelligence exactly. 47 missions had taught her that accurate reconnaissance was the foundation of every successful operation. As the team prepared to move the hostages toward the extraction route, voices could be heard from the compound's central area. The guard shift change was beginning, which meant their window for silent escape was closing rapidly. Rachel signaled for the team to hold position while she moved to the room's window, using specialized optics to assess the compound's current status. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Additional vehicles had arrived since their insertion, bringing reinforcements that hadn't appeared in any intelligence reports. She returned to the group and held up 8 fingers, then 12, indicating that the enemy's strength had increased significantly. The extraction route she had planned was now potentially compromised by guards who hadn't been present during reconnaissance. Callahan understood immediately. The mission parameters had changed, requiring adaptation under combat conditions. This was exactly the type of situation that separated special operations from conventional military actions. Rachel pulled out a hand-drawn map of the compound, marking new positions and alternate routes with movements that spoke to mental preparation for exactly this type of complication. She had anticipated that the mission might require improvisation. "New route," she whispered to the team, tracing a path that led through areas they hadn't scouted. "More difficult, but it avoids the additional guards." The alternate extraction required moving through the compound's main building, past areas where detection was almost certain. It was the kind of high-risk approach that succeeded only when executed with absolute precision. "Ma'am," Brooks whispered, "what happens if we're detected during the new route?" Rachel met his eyes directly. "Then we fight our way out and hope. Our training is better than theirs." It wasn't reassurance, but it was honesty. Special operations succeeded because they planned for complications and adapted when plans failed. The alternative was accepting casualties that could be avoided through superior tactics and execution. As they prepared to move, Rachel took point with confidence that seemed to radiate outward to the rest of the team. The soldiers who had underestimated her 3 days ago now followed her lead without question, understanding that their lives depended on her expertise. The movement through the main building required passing within feet of guards who would immediately raise alarms if they detected the rescue team. Rachel led them through corridors and rooms with intimate knowledge of the compound's layout, each step calculated to minimize exposure while maintaining progress toward extraction. Private Brooks found himself amazed at the way Rachel seemed to anticipate every obstacle, every potential complication. The woman who had quietly organized ammunition while being mocked and dismissed was now demonstrating tactical excellence at a level he had never imagined possible. They reached the compound's rear exit without detection, but the final phase of extraction would require crossing open ground to reach the helicopter landing zone. It was the most dangerous part of the operation, where concealment would be impossible and speed would determine success or failure. Rachel paused at the exit, studying the terrain between their position and safety. 12 miles of hostile territory lay ahead, complicated by additional enemies and the burden of protecting 3 civilians who lacked military training. But as she looked at the soldiers who now understood exactly who they were following, Rachel allowed herself a moment of confidence. 47 missions had taught her that the impossible became possible when executed by people who refused to accept failure. The extraction would test everything they had learned about trust, competence, and the difference between ordinary soldiers and the elite operators who brought everyone home alive. The extraction from the compound proceeded with the mechanical precision of a plan executed by people who understood that failure was not an option. Rachel led the combined group of soldiers and rescued hostages through terrain that would have been challenging for experienced military personnel. But the civilians kept pace with determination born from understanding that their lives depended on reaching the helicopter landing zone. The 12-mile journey to the extraction point required 6 hours of careful movement through hostile territory, using natural cover and predetermined routes to avoid the search parties that Vargas had deployed once he discovered the empty holding room. Rachel's intimate knowledge of the region's geography proved invaluable as she guided them around patrols and through passages that didn't appear on any official maps. Private Brooks found himself constantly amazed at the way Rachel seemed to anticipate every potential complication. She moved through the darkness with confidence that spoke to years of similar operations, always knowing exactly where they were and where they needed to go next. "Ma'am," he whispered during one of their brief rest periods, "how many times have you been through this area?" "Enough times to know it better than the people who live here," Rachel replied simply. Master Sergeant Callahan observed her leadership with the appreciation of someone who had spent 20 years learning to recognize genuine expertise. The woman who had been dismissed as support staff was now demonstrating tactical excellence that exceeded anything in his experience. As dawn approached, they reached the helicopter landing zone where their extraction aircraft waited. The rescued hostages were immediately transferred to medical personnel for evaluation, while Rachel began the process of debriefing with Colonel Vaden via secure communication. All objectives completed successfully, she reported with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had never expected any other outcome. 3 hostages rescued without casualties. Compound intelligence confirmed and updated for future operations. The flight back to forward operating base Sentinel carried the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed without the complications that had seemed inevitable hours earlier. The soldiers who had begun the deployment with nervous uncertainty now displayed the confidence of people who had been tested under extreme conditions and proven themselves capable. Upon returning to the base, Rachel immediately resumed her position at the ammunition depot, beginning the methodical process of accounting for unused ordnance and equipment. To casual observers, it might have seemed like nothing had changed, but the base around her had been fundamentally transformed. Soldiers who passed by now nodded respectfully or offered quiet greetings. The casual dismissal that had characterized her first 3 days at the base had been replaced by recognition that carried weight. They had witnessed someone operate at a level they hadn't known existed. Lieutenant Hawkins approached as Rachel completed her equipment inventory, her posture notably different from their previous interactions. Where there had once been dismissive authority, there was now careful deference mixed with professional curiosity. "Operator Martinez," she began formally, "I wanted to personally apologize for my behavior before the mission. I was unaware of your status and treated you with disrespect. That was completely inappropriate." Rachel looked up from her clipboard. "There's nothing to apologize for, Lieutenant. My role required anonymity. Even so, I pride myself on professional conduct. I should have questioned why logistics would send personnel 3 days before a classified extraction operation, especially someone whose credentials were above my clearance level." "That's the point of Echo Red," Rachel replied. "We exist in the gaps between attention. If you had noticed immediately, I wouldn't have been doing my job correctly." Hawkins nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. "The intelligence you gathered during those 3 days. That's why you knew about the additional tunnel systems and guard rotations that weren't in our official reports." "Intelligence gathering is an ongoing process," Rachel confirmed. "Sometimes the most valuable information comes from sources that aren't included in formal briefings." Colonel Vaden arrived, carrying a folder stamped with classified markings. "Operator Martinez, your mission report has been forwarded to higher command." They were, as you might expect, very interested to learn about the intelligence network you've mapped in this region. Rachel nodded, but said nothing, maintaining the professional distance that characterized Echo Red operations. "I've arranged proper quarters for you," Vaden continued. "Officer section, private entrance, more suitable for someone of your actual rank and security clearance." "Thank you, sir, but I work better from the shadows," Rachel declined politely. "The supply tent corner serves my purposes for the remaining duration of my assignment." Vaden studied her for a moment. "Very well, but I want you to know that your contribution here is recognized, even if most will never know the full extent of it." "Recognition isn't why I do this, sir," Rachel replied. "I know," Vaden said. "That's precisely why you wear that patch." Private Brooks approached hesitantly, carrying a small object in his hands. "Ma'am, I wanted to return something." He held out the tactical gloves he had taken during his earlier mockery, the high-quality gear that should have been his first clue about her true identity. "I was completely wrong about you," he said quietly, "about everything. I made assumptions based on appearances and nearly compromised operational security as a result." Rachel accepted the gloves, studying Brooks with the same careful assessment she had used during mission planning. "What did you learn from the experience, Private?" "That surface appearances can be deliberately misleading," Brooks replied immediately. "That the most dangerous people are often the ones you don't see coming. And that respect should be based on competence, not rank or recognition." "Good," Rachel said. "Those are lessons that will serve you well in future operations." As Brooks departed, Master Sergeant Callahan joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Black, no sugar," he said, setting one beside her. "Figured that's how someone like you would take it." Rachel accepted the cup with a slight nod of appreciation. "Thank you, Sergeant." "That tunnel system you used," Callahan said after a moment. "It wasn't on any of our maps, not even the classified ones." "No," Rachel agreed. "It wouldn't be. You've been in this region before, multiple times. Several times, Rachel confirmed. Echo Red operators work in areas where conventional intelligence gathering isn't possible. We go where others can't, learn what others don't, and prepare for operations that may never officially happen. Callahan nodded slowly, understanding the implications. The way you handled that final extraction, moving 12 miles through hostile territory with 3 civilians in tow. Never seen anything like it. The mission was successful, Rachel replied simply. That's what matters. Right, Callahan agreed, recognizing her discomfort with personal recognition. Well, for what it's worth, it was an honor serving under your command. As evening approached, Rachel stood at the base's perimeter fence, watching the sun set over the distant mountains where they had successfully completed what others had deemed nearly impossible. Tomorrow she would board a transport helicopter and disappear, moving on to another base, another mission, another identity. The red patch remained hidden beneath her collar once again, as would her true purpose and abilities. It was what made Echo Red so effective, the ability to move unseen through the world, to be dismissed and overlooked until the moment when it mattered most. She preferred it that way. Recognition was never what she sought. The mission was everything. And the mission continued. Somewhere else, other soldiers would dismiss another quiet logistics worker who seemed unremarkable, never knowing that they were in the presence of someone who had dedicated their life to ensuring that everyone came home alive. Rachel Martinez smiled slightly as she watched the last light fade from the sky. 48 missions now, 0 casualties. The perfect record remained intact, along with the perfect anonymity that made such records possible. In the morning, she would become someone else, somewhere else, ready to step out of the shadows whenever. Soldiers needed her expertise to survive the impossible. It was exactly the life she had chosen, and exactly the legacy she intended to maintain. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.